Well, I'm very much looking forward to this paper on conspiracy theories as a mimicry. And our invited speaker is Michael Butter. And I haven't met Michael, and this is my first introduction to your work, so I'm very excited to hear about it. But from the bio, we know that Michael has been Professor of American Literal and Cultural History at the University of Tübingen. And his research interests include the colonial period in the early republic, the construction of heroes, their cultural functions, and the poetics of contemporary TV shows. We focus today is on conspiracy theories and populism, which, as we all know only too well, is one of the animating features of the present zeitgeist in a way that's very worrying. So we'll hear from Michael first. So without further ado, Michael, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Kieran, for the kind introduction, and thanks again for the invitation. The title of my talk is slightly misleading because it's of course appropriate for the topic, but it is not the whole truth of what I will be doing today. It's basically only what I do in the first part, that I discuss how conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists mimic scholarly discourse in order to make their arguments more plausible. And then in the second and third part of the talk, I move on to related but slightly different topics. Before we get started, however, I would like to quickly define conspiracy theory, because it's of course a very loaded term, and this is something that scholarship has always struggled with, that this is not a neutral academic designation, but one that immediately implies that the ideas that are labeled as such are wrong, and in the worst case scenario implies that people who promote conspiracy theories are paranoid or otherwise mentally ill. This is of course not what I mean to imply when I use this term and this concept, and fortunately enough, there is wide agreement among scholars from different disciplines about how to define conspiracy theories. Unlike, for example, with populism, which is the second major concept that I'm working on these days, where there is such a disagreement among different schools that it's difficult to position yourself within that field with a research group where people come from different disciplines and with different interests. Conspiracy theories are easier in that way. Michael Barkun, a political scientist who wrote one of the first major studies on conspiracy theories in the early 2000s, argues that conspiracy theories always share three major assumptions. They assume, first of all, that nothing happens by accident. In other words, they assume that everything has been planned. And by whom? By a group of human agents, the conspirators. These are the people who are controlling the course of events and who are manipulating events in order to reach their sinister goals. Secondly, conspiracy theories assume that nothing is as it seems. In other words, they hold that the really important things are always happening in secret, that you always have to look beneath the surface, that you have to unveil things in order to realize how things really are, because the conspirators are involved in a clandestine operation. And thirdly, conspiracy theories assume that everything is connected. They hold that there are links between people, events, organizations, and developments that seem utterly unconnected on the surface, but once we look closer, we realize that it's all very much linked together. So for example, there are conspiracy theories about the 5G technology that assume that 5G is responsible for the emergence of the coronavirus, or in different versions for the disease that we now call COVID-19. So things that really have nothing to do with each other come together in the logic of conspiracy theory. Now, one thing one could say now is that, hold on a moment, nothing is as it seems and everything is connected. If you put this in a fancier way, this is something that we'll find in a lot of social science theories, for example, in globalization theories. And that is, of course, true. The thing that really sets conspiracy theories apart from modern scientific or scholarly theories is the assumption that it's intentional human action that really is responsible for everything important that happens. And since nothing important ever happens by coincidence or happens because of structural effects of complex social systems, conspiracy theorists always begin at the back. They always ask cui bono, who is profiting from a development? Because if nothing happens by accident, those people who benefit or who allegedly benefit, at least in the eyes of the conspirators, must be those who are responsible for these events and developments. So you have the people who are guilty, and then you kind of prove that they are really guilty. You make everything fit that can be made fit. You leave everything out that cannot be made to fit. And at the end, you realize that the people you had suspected all along are really those responsible for what is going on. Now, all scholarship on conspiracy theory is struggling with the heritage of Richard Hofstetter and his article on the paranoid style in American politics from 1964, where Hofstetter writes, among other things, the higher paranoid scholarship is nothing if not coherent. In fact, the paranoid mind is far more coherent than the real world. It is nothing if not scholarly in technique. McCarthy's 96 pamphlet, McCarthyism, contains no less than 313 footnote references. And Mr. Welch's incredible assault on Eisenhower, the politician, where Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, tries to show that Eisenhower is a communist agent and that the communists are actually in league with the Illuminati from the 18th century, has 100 pages of bibliography and notes. The entire right-wing movement of our time is a parade of expert study groups, monographs, footnotes, and bibliography. Sometimes the right-wing striving for scholarly depth and an inclusive worldview has startling consequences. Now, leading back to Hofstetter always gives me kind of tummy aches because he has done a lot of harm to research on conspiracy theories, as I pointed out in an article that came out last year. Many of his claims are problematic. For example, that he links conspiracy theories to paranoia, that he claims that conspiracy theories had always been a minority movement only on the radical fringes in American history, and a couple of other things. Generally speaking, what he says about paranoia is problematic. What he says about style in conspiracy theories is really helpful and still valuable today. He may have missed the larger historical narrative of how conspiracy theories have developed, but he observes correctly that conspiracy theories strive for scholarly depth. So in other words, we could say that what they are trying to do is a mimicry of serious scholarly discourse. And this is what I want to focus on in the first part of my talk. I want to investigate how conspiracy theories really mimic academic discourse. However, as I already said, this is not the whole story. And in the second part, therefore, I will give you a larger historical perspective, because conspiracy theories for a very long time were the accepted scholarly discourse. And this is why even today, academic discourse sometimes struggles with shedding all traces of conspiracism and can thus be said to unconsciously mimic conspiracist explanations, at least in part, in turn, as I discuss in this part. And I have drawn on the concept of unconscious mimesis from the project that is organizing this conference to theorize this a little bit. And then in the third part, I want to very quickly demonstrate that, quite ironically, even those activists and scholars who are trying to fight conspiracy theories because they consider them dangerous, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for not so good reasons, tend to replicate some of the structures of conspiracism. So another case of unconscious mimesis that we find there. So let's begin with the first part, with what I called conspiracist mimicry. I'm using the term mimicry here because for me, and this probably would be very much a textbook definition of mimicry, mimicry means a kind of conscious deception to gain strategic advantage, as we might find it, for example, in the animal realm or among certain flowers that are mimicking poisonous plants or poisonous animals or dangerous animals in order to protect themselves. And something similar is sometimes happening in conspiracist discourse, not in order to protect themselves, but conspiracy theorists can be said to employ a form of mimicry when it comes to experts. Experts are incredibly important for conspiracist discourse because experts allow you to give credence to the claims that you're making. They can legitimize your allegations. The problem that conspiracy theories are challenged with these days is, of course, that most experts these days are rather adverse to conspiracy theories. But conspiracy theories, therefore, look for their own experts. They are obsessed with titles, professor, doctor, whatsoever. This is always highlighted in a conspiracist discourse in order to legitimize the people who are articulating conspiracy theories there. And very often, therefore, what conspiracy theories do is that they kind of veil where the real expertise of the people they present as experts lies in. What you see here on the screen is the cover of David Ray Griffin's book, The Mysterious Collapse of World Trade Center 7. So World Trade Center 7 is this third building that collapsed on 9/11. The building that, because it was hit by debris from the Twin Towers, the building that much of conspiracist discourse has focused on in recent years. And what Griffin is doing in this book is that he's taking the official report on that building apart, showing that the building could not have collapsed because of the debris from the Twin Towers. What is highlighted not on the cover, but throughout the book, on the back cover, for example, is that David Ray Griffin is a professor. However, if you do a little research, you find out that he's a professor of religious studies. So he has no expertise whatsoever when it comes to engineering and architecture, but he is presented as possessing this expertise. So what we find here is something like a mimicry of academic discourse, but of course with a deception at its heart. Like proper academics, conspiracy theorists very often look for textual evidence to prove their claims. And the best thing that they can find is what we would call a smoking gun, a document that has emerged from within the circle of the conspirators and that proves or allegedly proves what they are really up to. On the left-hand side, you see a cover of an Arab edition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is, of course, a forgery. So even here, we sometimes have this kind of deceptive mimicry. But often enough, conspiracy theorists draw on real documents and claim that they are smoking guns by interpreting them. So for example, what you see on the right-hand side is a report by the think tank Project for a New American Century, which is a neoconservative think tank that in a policy paper from September 2000 called for an event like a new Pearl Harbor in order to bring about the processes that the think tank considers desirable. And for 9/11 conspiracy theorists, this is evidence that these guys are really behind the attacks on the World Trade Center because, of course, the World Trade Center was very often linked or described as a new Pearl Harbor. As Hofstetter already pointed out, conspiracy theorists really mimic academic discourse in that they constantly quote sources and that they have long lists of footnotes and endnotes and bibliography. So this is an article that appeared a couple of weeks ago on a German conspiracy theory website, by the way, written by a professor of media studies at the University of Munich, who is quite an embarrassment to that university by now. But what you see here is that conspiracy theorists very often quote serious scholarly texts. Hannah Arendt, Berger-Luckmann, The Social Construction of Reality, a book published by Columbia University Press. But the way, of course, that they are dealing with these sources is different from at least the ideal of scholarly discourse. Maybe not scholarly discourse in practice all the time, but the ideal of scholarly discourse. And conspiracy theorists, of course, also mimic scholarly discourse or scientific discourse in that they constantly interpret graphs, statistics, and data, especially in the corona crisis, where, of course, information from medicine and the natural sciences has become more and more important. What you see here is a screenshot from another German conspiracy theory website and another recent article that tries to prove that the booster vaccinations actually caused many deaths and that the authorities are trying to hide that. Of course, the truth is completely different. People were dying of COVID, and this is why the vaccinations also increased, because people were afraid of that. But the article provides a lot of graphs, quotes a lot of studies in order to prove this point. So once again, another example of how conspiracy theories mimic academic discourse. The gist of all of that is that it would be too easy to dismiss conspiracy theories as simply wrong, because very often they make claims that are correct, then they make others that are completely wrong, then they twist certain information, they take it out of context, or they give it a certain spin. But it's not that it is all made up. And therefore, conspiracy theories are, I think, best described as half-truths, as Nicolas Guess, a professor of German literature from the University of Basel, does in a book that came out in 2021. And if you don't read German, you can check out a short article by her that came out earlier this year, where she presents her idea of half-truths in English. What she argues is that for conspiracy theories, internal coherence actually counts more than correspondence to an external state of affairs. Thus, we could say that at the end of the day, then, conspiracy theories might mimic academic discourse, but when it comes to reality, they might not be mimetic enough, because they replace an adequate representation of reality or truth, and I know this is an extremely loaded term, with fiction. However, the problem with that is, of course, that at the end of the day, it is in the eye of the beholder if we consider something only coherent or also corresponding. Nowadays, in the Western world, where conspiracy theories are completely stigmatized, Guess is, of course, absolutely right. But over the course of history, this has been considered in a very different fashion. Which brings me to my second part, the historical angle on how all of this has developed. And I will explain just in a moment what I mean by unconscious mimesis. So it might come as a surprise, but it has by now been well established by scholars that we are not living in an age of conspiracy theories in the Western world, even though it feels like that. In fact, conspiracy theories are today much less popular than they were throughout most of modern history. There is some disagreement on when conspiracy theories first emerged in their modern form. Most scholars would point to the early modern period, and from then onward until into the second half of the 20th century, it is completely normal to believe in conspiracy theories. George Washington does it, John Adams does it, Thomas Jefferson does it, Abraham Lincoln does it, Dwight D. Eisenhower does it, and many other American presidents do so as well. And conspiracy theories in the 18th and 19th and early 20th century are not spun by pseudo scholars or by paranoid figures on the fringes, but by really established scholars. So this is the cover of John Robinson's Proofs of a Conspiracy Against the Religions and Governments of Europe, in which he tries to prove that the French Revolution was orchestrated by the Freemasons and by the Illuminati. And Robinson, as you see in the small print, was one of the most respected scholars of his time. He was a professor of natural philosophy at Edinburgh. He basically wrote one of the volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, basically himself on his own, and he was corresponding with established scholars all over Europe. And the smartest minds of their time believed that the world was driven by large conspiracies. So conspiracy theories were not a shallow copy of academic discourse at that time, but they actually were the official academic discourse at that time in Europe and in North America. We have known that for a very, very long time. And one of the best articles on that is by Gordon Wood, who is one of the most important historians of the early American Republic. He published an article in the early 80s already on why it was completely normal to believe in conspiracy theories in the 17th and 18th century. And in order to explain why those figures that we call the founding fathers actually did that. And he comes to the conclusion that the most enlightened of the age could not only conclude that regular patterns of behavior were the consequences of concerted human intentions, that is the result of a number of people coming together to promote a collective design or conspiracy. So he shows that people like John Locke and their ideas fueled conspiracism. For example, the Enlightenment assumption that the moral quality of an action always corresponded to the moral quality of the intention behind that action. And he goes to great lengths, and other people like Stephen Shapin have followed in his tracks to show how normal it was to believe in conspiracy theories and how conspiracy theories were the official discourse for a very, very long time. This only changed in the 1950s and 60s in what we by now call the Western world. Outside of the Western world, it's different in many of these places, Eastern Europe, for example, but also the Arab world. It's still quite normal and accepted to believe in conspiracy theories and to articulate them. But in the United States and large parts of Europe, conspiracy theories underwent the process of stigmatization, as Katharina Thalmann has demonstrated in an excellent book on that issue, in which she really looks at how the popularization of insights from the social sciences lead to conspiracy theories moving from the mainstream of society to the margins of society, and from stopping to be accepted scholarly discourse to basically, yeah, a mimicry of scholarly discourse. But since the social sciences kind of developed out of conspiracy theories then, some of them still carry traces of that. A prime example of that, something that I will elaborate on in an article I plan to write in the second half of the year, would be the work of Michel Foucault, where you always have the problem of power and agency, and how do you locate that, and how are things actually happening and changing, because a lot of agency is described to discourse. And you could take long paragraphs out of Foucault, and if you just replace discourse with conspirators, it would sound like a conspiracy theory. And therefore, I would claim, and I know that this is more of a hypothesis, given how I have backed up this claim, than a real thesis, that what we're seeing in the modern social sciences is sometimes a kind of unconscious mimesis of what conspiracy theories held. And that is, as I said, because the modern social sciences emerged to a large part from scholarly discourses that promoted conspiracy theories. And I was very happy to find on the project website of this project on Homo Mimeticus, the idea of the mimetic unconscious, because I think this captures really well what is happening there. You could also in a way see this as a kind of remnant that you try to shed, but that you are not always entirely aware of. On a more fun level, after all, I am a scholar of literature, after all, there are certain uncanny resemblances between what literary critics do and what conspiracy theories do. At the end of the day, of course, as literary critics in the classroom, we also very often tell our students that nothing is as it seems, that the text that they think is about one thing is actually about something else entirely. We also claim that the passage on page 7 is connected to the final paragraph on page 437, and we may no longer ascribe all of that to the author, but we basically, just as Foucault talks about discourse, we talk about the text, and it's the text doing certain things, and therefore we see how difficult it is to shed this language of human agency. So even here one could say a kind of unconscious mimesis of conspiracism. Which brings me to my final part that I entitled Anti-Conspiracist Unconscious Mimetic. Mises, because not only in scholarly discourse in general do we find these unconscious imitations of conspiracist discourse, but even among scholars and activists who are really concerned about conspiracy theories. And very often they are concerned about conspiracy theories for very good reasons. We know that conspiracy theories can be very dangerous. They can be a catalyst for radicalization, and thus at the end of the day can lead to violence. We saw that in Christchurch in New Zealand. We saw that with the attack on a synagogue in Halle in Germany 2 years ago. And of course, we saw it when the Capitol was stormed on January the 6th, 2021. And of course, we also know, and this is something that we're investigating in my populism and conspiracy theory project, that conspiracy theories can be a danger to democracy because they can undermine and destroy the trust in democratic processes and institutions. And once again, the storm on the Capitol, the attempt to stop Congress from ratifying the result of the presidential election would be exactly such an event. Not all conspiracy theories are dangerous, but there is a lot to be concerned about, especially for an Americanist like me when we look at the United States, but of course also when we look at Europe and when we look at what's happening in Ukraine and the way that Vladimir Putin justified the invasion by using conspiracy theories. And this is why there is now a vibrant activist discourse on conspiracy theories that is sometimes scholarly informed and sometimes not at all. So the other event that I'm going to tomorrow in Amsterdam is a stakeholder event where there will be people from the British Secret Service, from fact-checking organizations, from Facebook and other social media to talk about what to do about conspiracy theories. Now, the interesting thing is that very often the people who are most concerned about conspiracy theories kind of unconsciously mimic some of the major assumptions of conspiracy theories. So again, unconscious mimesis at work here. Research has shown that most people who promote conspiracy theories genuinely believe in them. There are always people who use them strategically, but this happens far more rarely than public discourse assumes. Even Vladimir Putin, to give you one example, seems to believe in his own conspiracy theories about Ukraine. Otherwise, it would be difficult to explain why the military campaign went so different from how he apparently imagined that. In the discourse on conspiracy theories, however, not only in Germany, but in many other countries, it's very often a distinction is being made between manipulators and dupes. So there are a couple of people who are pulling all the strings within a conspiracy theory movement, and they don't believe a thing of what they are saying, but then there are those who believe everything they tell them, and they use these people and they manipulate them. And of course, this corresponds exactly to the distinction that conspiracy theories make, where they say on the one hand, we have the conspirators who are all powerful and know what's going on, and then we have the broad mass of people who have no idea what is happening. Very often, especially during the demonstrations against the corona restrictions in Germany, but also in other countries, pundits made the claim that in reality, these protests are not about COVID or the restrictions, but they are meant to radically transform our society. And that's not entirely wrong, because of course these people think they are no longer living in a democratic society and they want to transform the society, but they're very much concerned about COVID and the COVID restrictions, which also explains why these protests have basically disappeared now that all restrictions have been lifted, even in Germany. But this assumption that in reality it's about something else is of course something that exactly once again mimics conspiracist discourse, where conspiracy theorists claim, well, this is what it looks like on the surface, but what's actually going on is something completely different. And my final point here is that, especially in Germany, there is this tendency in dealing with conspiracy theories to claim that at the end of the day, all conspiracy theories are anti-Semitic. This would deserve a whole talk to show why this is not the case, but it's a position that has long been dismissed in scholarship. But of course, in Germany and especially among left-wing German activists, due to the horrible events in the 20th century in Germany, this is still a very popular position. So when these people, these activists look at demonstrations or conspiracy theories online, very, very often they make the claim, well, these people basically are talking about Bill Gates, they might be talking about George W. Bush, they might be talking about Angela Merkel, but at the end of the day, what they're concerned about are Jewish conspiracies. And once again here, then we could see this idea of everything is connected, everything can be boiled down to something completely different. All conspiracy theories are one. So once again, we see how this discourse mimics the conspiracist discourse. I'll stop here because according to my watch, I only have like 10 seconds left. And I hope I could give you some idea what my research is about and why the concept of mimesis and mimicry actually is a really valuable one in order to think about conspiracy theories and different aspects of conspiracist and anti-conspiracist discourse. In many ways, what I presented today is just the beginning of a process of thinking through that, and it will probably take me a little bit longer, but I think I've put some things on the table and I'm very much looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you so much.